You want to know what execution feels like in the 16th century, how brutal it was, unlike the type we have in the 21st century? Then this video is for you. In the years 1531 to 1599, there were a series of executions. But these were not just deaths. They were spectacles of power, betrayal, and unimaginable cruelty, so brutal, so disturbing, that even in an age already used to violence, people looked away. Men who once stood beside kings. A powerful minister, once untouchable, the second most powerful man in all of England, was dragged to the block and butchered by a drunk, incompetent executioner in front of a jeering crowd. While the king who condemned him was celebrating his wedding on the very same day. A 67-year-old royal woman, the last of her bloodline, was given 1 hour notice of her own death, with no trial, no crime, and no proper executioner even present. Just a nervous boy with an axe. It took him 11 blows. 11 bad blows to execute her. And people say her ghost still runs. A poisoner boiled alive in a cauldron until his flesh peeled from his bones. These were not ordinary punishments. These were warnings carved in blood and written in fire for anyone who dared to challenge the throne. And as each axe dismembered the head from the body, each flame rose, and each life was extinguished, one question echoed through the silence that followed. Were they truly guilty, or were they victims of something far more dangerous than any crime they could have committed? Or was it power and authority? In this video, we walk through 6 of the most brutal executions of the 16th century. And with each one, the methods become more disturbing, the stories are more tragic, and the truth, far more complicated than history was ever meant to admit. Number 1. Thomas Cromwell, the king's most faithful servant. On the morning of July 28, 1540, Tower Hill, London, the crowd had gathered early. Thousands of them, merchants, noblemen, clergy, commoners, pressing against each other in the summer heat, craning their necks for a better view. Some of them are weeping. Most of them are not. Most of them are smiling. The man climbing the scaffold steps is someone they all know. Everyone in England knows him. For nearly a decade, he was the second most powerful person in the entire kingdom, second only to the king himself. He drafted the laws. He dissolved the monasteries. He rewrote the church. He signed the warrants. He sent men to their deaths with the scratch of a quill. Now he is the one climbing the steps. He is dressed simply. His face is calm, unnervingly calm for a man who knows exactly what is about to happen. He reaches the top of the scaffold, turns to face the crowd, and begins to speak. He confesses his sins. He asks for forgiveness. He says he dies in the faith. Then he kneels at the block, places his neck against the wood, stretches out his arms, and waits. The executioner raises the axe. And then, everything goes wrong. Who was he? That man was Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell was born around 1485 to Walter Cromwell and his wife Catherine Meverell. Walter was a blacksmith, brewer, and tradesman in the district of Putney, South London. There was nothing about his beginnings that suggested greatness. His father was repeatedly fined for brawling, fraud, and breaking brewing laws. The family scraped by. Thomas received a basic education, enough to read, write, and pray, and that should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. At some point in his youth, Cromwell left England entirely. He became first a mercenary in the French army, involved in the terrible defeat the French suffered at Garigliano in December 1503, and then the servant of an Italian merchant who found Cromwell begging in the street, and recognizing an Englishman far from home, took pity on him. That merchant changed his life. In Italy, working in the world of Florentine banking and Renaissance commerce, Cromwell not only developed phenomenal business acumen, but acquired an interest in art, literature, and the new artistic styles of painting. He absorbed languages. He observed how power actually worked, not in theory, but in ledgers and contracts, and whispered conversations over dinner tables. He returned to England a different man entirely. He studied law. He built a legal practice. He caught the eye of Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII Great Lord Chancellor, and rose quickly through his service. When Wolsey fell from grace in 1529, nearly every man who served him abandoned him instantly. Cromwell was one of precious few attendants who remained loyal to him until the end. Henry VIII noticed. Within a few years, Cromwell had climbed from Wolsey's shadow directly into the king's inner circle. He served as chief minister to Henry VIII from 1532 to 1540, masterminding the English Reformation, overseeing the dissolution of the monasteries, and restructuring England's finances and government from the ground up. What kind of man was he? Those who served him described someone who worked with inhuman efficiency, processing mountains of correspondence, managing dozens of projects simultaneously, never seeming to rest. He enjoyed hunting, hawking, and kept greyhounds. He played bowls, cards, and dice, gambling at high stakes, as was common at Henry's court. He wined and dined his friends and employed musicians to entertain them. But beneath the sociable surface lived something harder and colder. A contemporary described Thomas Cromwell as a quick-witted and prompt of resolution, knowing excellent well to accommodate himself to the wishes of others, and could dissemble his purpose better than any man in the world. He could read a room like a document, and act on it before anyone else had finished reading. He was, in the most precise sense of the word, dangerous. Henry VIII himself said it plainly. "I keep you, Master Cromwell, because you are as cunning as a bag of serpents." Imagine a king telling his second such. The charge that killed Thomas Cromwell was not really about treason or heresy. It was about a woman and a portrait. Cromwell had orchestrated Henry's fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves, the eldest daughter of the Duke of Cleves, as a diplomatic move to secure Protestant allies against Catholic France and Spain. He had shown the king a flattering portrait. He had assured Henry she was everything a king could want. But she wasn't. Henry and Cromwell had been misled by an overly flattering portrait. When they finally met, and immediately displeased the king, in her looks, her personal hygiene, her loud voice, and her brash manners. Henry, in private fury, called her the Flanders mare. He married her anyway, because he had no choice, but the humiliation festered. Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves later divorced by mutual consent on July 9, 1540. Anne of Cleves escaped with her life and a generous settlement from Henry VIII. But Cromwell did not escape at all. His enemies had been waiting years for a moment like this. The Catholic faction at court, led by the Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Gardiner, had long despised Cromwell for driving the Reformation, destroying the monasteries, and humiliating the old nobility. The tensions between the opposing factions at court had grown so bitter by spring and early summer of 1540 that it seemed that one must yield. Now they had their opening. A bill of attainder was prepared, a list of charges so sweeping and contradictory they would have been laughable in a proper court. They accused him of protecting heretics, of speaking treasonous words, of corrupt practices, of plotting to marry the king's own daughter. Given that he was the country's most renowned lawyer, his enemies dared not risk putting him on trial. Instead, they persuaded the king to bring a bill of attainder before Parliament, bypassing every legal protection Cromwell might otherwise have used to defend himself. The man who had invented legal destruction for so many others was now being destroyed by his own machinery. On June 10, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was suddenly arrested in the council chamber at Westminster. The great George of the Garter was snatched from his neck and the garter untied, in contempt of his elevation. His former friend the Duke of Norfolk spat the words, "A traitor must not wear it." Cromwell's first reaction was not fear, it was fury. "This then is my reward for faithful service," he cried out. But the fury faded quickly. He was taken by barge to the Tower of London, the same fortress he had overseen, renovated, and used to cage others for years. From his prison cell, Cromwell wrote a series of increasingly desperate letters to his sovereign Henry VIII, begging him to spare his life. These were not the cold, precise documents of a chief minister. They were the writings of a terrified man, rambling, emotional, stripped of all the authority he had spent decades building. He swore his loyalty. He begged for a private audience. He asked only for the chance to look Henry in the eye and speak. The king refused to see him. The last letter ended with a plaintive postscript. "Most gracious prince, I cry for mercy, mercy, mercy." Henry had it read to him 3 times, and then did nothing. The Bill of Attainder passed on June 29th. All his titles were stripped. He was publicly proclaimed to be nothing more than Thomas Cromwell, the cloth carter, reduced in law to the trade of his father. Every title, every honor, every achievement of 30 years, erased by parliamentary decree. He was given no trial, no jury, no opportunity to face a single one of his accusers. The most powerful lawyer in England was condemned without ever being permitted to argue a word in his own defense. For 7 weeks he sat in the Tower, waiting. The king delayed the execution. He still needed Cromwell to provide evidence supporting the annulment of the Anne of Cleves marriage. Cromwell was being spared for the time being in case he was needed to give evidence of the king's distaste for Anne. Even at the end, he was a tool. Once the annulment was secured, he was no longer useful. The date was set on July 28, 1540. The same day was the king's wedding to Catherine Howard. On the morning of the execution, Cromwell called for his breakfast and, after cheerfully eating the same food served to him since he was in prison, he set out to the scaffold. On his way he met Lord Hungerford, condemned to die that same day for serious sexual offenses, who was looking heavy and doleful. Cromwell, still cheerful, bid him take heart and not to fear. He climbed Tower Hill before a crowd of thousands. Many had come to celebrate. These were the people whose monasteries he had seized, whose clergy he had humiliated, whose old religious world he had dismantled brick by brick. Many lamented, but more rejoiced, especially those who had been religious men, for they banqueted and triumphed together that night, many wishing that day had been 7 years before. At the top of the scaffold, Cromwell addressed the crowd in a clear, steady voice. He acknowledged he was a sinner. He asked forgiveness from God and from the king. He declared his faith. He spoke without self-pity and without bitterness, which in itself was a kind of courage that the crowd had not expected. Then he knelt at the block. What happened next became one of the most debated moments of the Tudor era. The Chronicle of Edward Hall describes that Cromwell so patiently suffered the stroke of the axe by a ragged and butcherly miser, which very ungoodly performed the office. Another one said, it took 3 blows of the axe by the incompetent executioner to sever his head. 3 blows. Each one a failure of mercy. Each one prolonging a death that should have taken a single second. Afterwards, his head was set on a spike on London Bridge, the traditional fate of traitors, displayed to every person entering or leaving the city. While Thomas Cromwell, the son of a Putney blacksmith, the man who had remade England, was being executed, the king he served danced at his wedding. In the weeks and months that followed, Henry VIII began to understand what he had done. He later regretted Cromwell's execution, blaming it all on his Privy Council, saying that on the pretext of several trivial faults, they had made several false accusations which had resulted in him killing the most faithful servant he had ever had. Too late. Always too late, with Henry. The men who had engineered Cromwell's fall, Norfolk, Gardiner, the Catholic faction, believed they had won. They had not. The king's reign never fully recovered from the incident. England lurched from wife to wife, policy to policy, religious crisis to religious crisis, without the steady hand that had managed it all for a decade. And the cruelest irony of all? In 1537, Cromwell had arranged for Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, to be convicted and executed by attainder alone, the very instrument that now sealed his own doom. In a chilling twist of fate, Cromwell's destruction was secured by his own scheme. He had built the trap. He had just never imagined he would be the one inside it. His remains were buried in the Tower's Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, alongside his erstwhile rivals and Bullen and Thomas More, 3 people whose deaths he had been connected to. Number 2, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. It is 7 o'clock in the morning, May 27, 1541. Tower of London. The sun has barely risen over the Thames. The air is still cool. Inside the fortress walls, away from the public streets, away from the jeering crowds that usually line the roads to Tower Hill, approximately 150 people have gathered in near silence around a small wooden block placed directly on the ground with no scaffold. The door opens, and out walks a woman. She is 67 years old, frail, white-haired. She has been locked in this fortress for 2 years. She has been told, just 1 hour ago, that today is the day she dies. She was given no warning, no preparation, no priest to hear her final confession in peace. Just a knock on the cell door and a voice telling her she had an hour to live. She walks toward the block. The crowd parts for her. She looks at the low wooden stump on the ground and something shifts in her face. But it wasn't fear. She stops immediately. She turns to the executioner. He is not the regular executioner. He is a boy. A nervous, untrained boy who has never done this before, holding an axe in hands that are almost certainly trembling. Margaret Pole looks at him. Then she looks at the block. Then she says the words that will echo through history for 500 years. So should traitors do. And I am none. She refuses to kneel. And that is when everything falls apart. She was Margaret Pole, the daughter of Edward IV, brother George, Duke of Clarence, who was third in line to the throne at the time of her birth in August 1473. She was royalty in the most unambiguous sense, Plantagenet on every branch of her family tree, connected by blood to every English king who had reigned for the past century. The instability of life at the heart of royal power became apparent when Margaret was just 4 years old and her father was put to death at the Tower, drowned, as legend has it, in a butt of Malmsey wine, for plotting against his brother the king. Her mother had already died. At 4 years old, Margaret Pole was an orphan. Being witness to the deaths of numerous family members and the ever-shifting politics of the Wars of the Roses made Margaret a fearful and cautious woman. She learned early that royal blood was less a gift than a disease, something that made kings nervous, that drew envy and suspicion just the way light draws moths. When Henry VII came to the throne, her situation worsened. Her brother Edward, the last male Plantagenet claimant, was imprisoned in the Tower as a child and executed in 1499, simply for being who he was. Margaret watched. She learned. She survived by making herself small, quiet, and utterly loyal to whoever sat on the throne. She was well-educated, pious, and bookish, affectionate, outwardly submissive, but inwardly strong. Those who knew her saw the contradictions clearly. A woman of enormous personal dignity who had mastered the art of appearing unthreatening. A royal woman who had spent decades performing humility as a survival strategy, and performing it so convincingly that when Henry VIII came to power, he genuinely seemed to trust her. Margaret's fortunes improved dramatically with the accession of Henry VIII in 1509. He made her Countess of Salisbury, the first and only woman in Tudor England to hold a peerage title entirely in her own right. She became godmother to Princess Mary, then governess. She raised the young princess almost as her own daughter, presiding over the royal household at Ludlow Castle with quiet, steady authority. By 1538, she was among the top 5 wealthiest peers of her generation, a woman of property, influence, piety, and deep personal loyalty to the crown she had served through 3 reigns. She was, by every outward measure, safe. But she wasn't. In fact, no one close to Henry VIII has been safe. The poison that killed Margaret Pole had a name, and it was her son Reginald. He was brilliant, deeply devout, and possessed of a recklessness that seems almost suicidal in retrospect. From the relative safety of Europe, first France, then Italy, he had watched Henry VIII break from Rome with mounting horror. And then, in 1536, he stopped watching and started writing. Reginald publicly advocated foreign intervention in the affairs of his own native land. He claimed that Englishmen would be totally justified in taking up arms against their king. He wrote treatises attacking Henry's supremacy over the church. He corresponded with Catholic powers on the continent, urging them to move against England. He was, in the eyes of Henry VIII, a traitor, and a particularly infuriating one, because he was just out of reach. Henry could not get to Reginald. So he reached for the next best thing. Margaret had tried desperately to stop her son. She had written to him herself, strongly reproving him for his folly and advising him to take another way and serve our master as thy bounden duty is to do, unless thou wilt be the confusion of thy mother. She sent a copy of the letter directly to the king's council, demonstrating her own loyalty. She retired from court. She kept her head down. She did everything right. But it still made no difference. In November 1538, the arrests began. Margaret's sons, Henry Pole and others, were swept up in a wide net. Evidence was gathered. Servants were questioned. And then Thomas Cromwell, the same man who would be sent to the block the following year, turned his attention to Margaret herself. Her interrogation began in November, carried out by William Fitzwilliam, Earl of Southampton, and Thomas Goodrich, Bishop of Ely. Innocent of any treasonous activity, she responded with firm and clear answers to all questions. She denied everything. She was, by every account, unshakable in her composure and devastating in her logic. Fitzwilliam himself reportedly declared that she was either entirely innocent or the greatest traitor alive. He could not tell which. The evidence against her was almost laughably thin. The only concrete charges were that she had forbidden her servants to read the English Bible, and had once been seen burning a letter. And then, the piece of evidence Cromwell chose to hang her with, a tunic displaying the 5 wounds, a symbol used in the Northern rebellions, which was allegedly found among her belongings. The timing of this discovery was deeply suspicious. The tunic had not been found during an earlier search of her belongings in November 1538. It appeared only months later, conveniently, catastrophically. Whether it was planted, whether it was genuinely hers, or whether it was simply a garment with innocent origins wildly misrepresented, no one can say for certain. What is certain is that Cromwell used it, and Henry believed it, and Margaret had no way to fight back. In May 1539, a bill of attainder was issued against her. She was stripped of her titles, her lands, and her identity. By parliamentary decree, the Countess of Salisbury, one of the most powerful women in England, became simply Lady Margaret Pole. And then she was taken to the Tower. There was no trial, no jury, no court, no opportunity to speak in her own defense. The Bill of Attainder erased all of that. This terrifying instrument of royal jurisdiction allowed for noblemen to be stripped of their lands and their lives without recourse to the normal processes of the law. Cromwell had used it before. He understood its power perfectly. And now it was used against the woman who had committed no proven crime. Only the crime of having given birth to a son Henry could not reach. Inside the Tower, Margaret's situation was strange and telling in equal measure. Henry, apparently wrestling with some vestige of conscience, paid for her upkeep personally. The king paid adequate sums for her maintenance, including wages for a waiting woman. In March 1541, the king ordered warm gowns and footwear for her to wear. He clothed the woman he intended to kill. He fed her. He kept her warm. He sent clothes made by Catherine Howard's own tailor. And on the walls of her cell, Margaret carved words that told a different story than the king's apparent generosity. The following poem was found carved into the stone of her cell. "For traitors on the block should die. I am no traitor, no, not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so, towards the block I shall not go, nor make one step, as ye shall see. Christ in thy mercy, save thou me." She was not a broken woman sitting in the dark. She was a woman with her back straight, her mind clear, and her faith intact, carving her declaration of innocence into stone because she had nothing else left to write on. Then, in May 1541, everything changed. Just 2 months after Henry had spent a considerable sum on Margaret's apparel, the king suddenly ordered her execution, likely prompted by a rising in the north against his supremacy of the church, as well as by rumors that Reginald was planning to rescue his mother from the Tower. The order came without announcement. On the morning of May 27th, Margaret was told she would die within the hour. She answered that no crime had been attributed to her. She was right. But she was going to die anyway. At 7 a.m. on May 27, 1541, Lady Margaret Pole was led to her execution inside the Tower of London. Because of her royal descent, she was executed on the Tower grounds, on the same spot wherein Bullen had died 5 years earlier, before more than 150 spectators. There was not enough time to erect a proper scaffold. The usual executioner was not in residence. Only his novice had been left behind. So a boy was handed an axe, and an old woman was led out to die. When the sentence of death was made known to her, she found the thing very strange, not knowing of what crime she was accused of, nor how she had been sentenced. But at last, perceiving there was no remedy, she walked out of the dungeon towards the midst of the space in front of the tower, where there was no scaffold erected, nothing except a small block. She looked at it. She looked at the boy with the axe. And then she spoke. "So should traitors do. And I am none." She refused to lay her head on the block, declaring, "So should traitors do, and I am none." She turned her head every which way, instructing the executioner that if he wanted her head, he should take it as he could. What happened next was not an execution. It was a slaughter. She refused to put her head on the block. The inexperienced executioner delivered a blow anyway, which, instead of severing her head, gave her a deep cut in her shoulder. She cried out. She moved. The boy panicked. He swung again. The axeman chased her around the block, hacking at her neck. Shopweis, the imperial ambassador, who was present, attested that the elderly countess had suffered at the hands of a wretched and blundering youth who literally hacked her head and shoulders to pieces in the most pitiful manner. He eventually cut her down and killed her, although it took 11 bloody blows. 11 blows? A 67-year-old woman. A Plantagenet princess. The godmother of a future queen. The last direct descendant of the royal house that had ruled England for generations. Was executed with 11 blows of axe before she was beheaded. Among the spectators, some wept openly. Others stood in stunned, white-faced silence. The Lord Mayor of London was present. He watched and said nothing. Having her beheaded was completely counterproductive from a political standpoint. Henry had killed her because she had the audacity to have given birth to children who were too closely related to him, and therefore too close to his throne. But her death didn't alleviate the threat. It worsened it. Cardinal Reginald Pole, safe in Europe, beyond Henry's reach, received the news of his mother's death and did not break. He declared that he was now the proud son of a martyr. He continued his work against Henry's England with renewed fury for years. By killing Margaret, Henry had not neutralized his enemy. He had given his enemy a cause worth dying for. The reaction across Europe was one of widespread horror. Henry, already regarded by Catholic powers as a schismatic tyrant, had now executed a 67-year-old royal woman without trial, without crime, in the most brutal manner imaginable. The damage to England's international reputation was severe and lasting. 3 centuries later, Margaret was beatified by Pope Leo XIII for having laid down her life in defense of the true Orthodox faith. In 1886, the Church formally named her Blessed Margaret Pole, a martyr, a saint of the Catholic faith, executed for crimes she never committed. Her remains lie in the Tower Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, alongside Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, and Thomas Cromwell. And for the Tower? It is said that on the night of the anniversary of her death, her ghost is seen frantically running around Tower Green, blood streaming from her many wounds, reliving the frightful events of that day, forever pursued by her phantom executioner. Number 3. Richard Roose. At Smithfield, London. April 5, 1531. The crowd that has gathered that morning is unlike any that has assembled there before. Smithfield has seen death. It has seen William Wallace, the Scottish rebel, hanged, drawn, and quartered on this very ground in 1305. It has seen Wat Tyler, leader of the Peasants' Revolt, run through with a sword here in 1381. It has seen heretics burned. It has seen traitors broken. But it has never seen this kind of execution before. In the center of the open ground stands a large iron cauldron. Beneath it, a fire is already burning, orange and hungry, licking the black metal from below. Inside the cauldron, water is beginning to move. Like a trembling, churning boil that sends steam rising into the cold morning air. A man was brought forward in chains. He is nobody. A cook. A servant. A man whose name most people in this crowd did not know a month ago, and will struggle to remember a decade from now. He has no title. No fortune. No army of supporters weeping at the gates. He has only this moment. And the cauldron. And the fire underneath it. He is fastened to an iron chain attached to a gibbet, a mechanical arm positioned directly above the boiling water. The crowd presses forward. Some crane their necks in morbid fascination. Some already look pale. Some of the pregnant women near the front are being quietly steered toward the back by their companions. The chain begins to lower. Richard Roose opens his mouth. And the screaming begins. Nothing is known of Roose, including his real name, or his life outside the case. He existed in the historical record for one reason and one reason only, because of what happened on a February afternoon in 1531 in the kitchen of a bishop's London residence. Before that day, he was invisible, he was just a man who cooked soup. After that day, he was infamous. He went by several names: Richard Roose, Richard Rouse, Richard Cook, Richard Rose. He may have been Fisher's household cook, or less likely, a friend of the cook at Fisher's residence in Lambeth. That simple ambiguity, cook or friend of the cook, tells you everything about how little power Richard Roose had in the world. Even his precise role in the household of a bishop was uncertain. He was an ordinary man, a nobody who silently passed through the pages of history. To understand what Richard Roose did, you first need to understand the man whose soup he poisoned. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, was one of the most formidable churchmen in England. Scholar, theologian, confessor to Henry VIII's own grandmother. He had been described by contemporaries as the greatest Catholic theologian in Europe without any rival. Henry himself had once been proud of Fisher's international reputation, had boasted of him to visiting scholars and foreign diplomats. But by 1531, that pride had curdled into something much more dangerous. Fisher was one of the vocal opponents of Henry's plans to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, and he was not quiet about it. He had announced in open court that he would sooner die than betray the cause of the Queen. He had written book after book defending Catherine's marriage. He had stood in Parliament and called the Archbishop of Canterbury a liar, to his face, within earshot of the king. He had resisted, defied, and embarrassed Henry at every possible turn. By early 1531, the imperial ambassador reported that parties unnamed but close to the king had threatened to throw Fisher and his followers into the River Thames if he continued his opposition. The air around John Fisher crackled with threat. Then in the early afternoon of February 18, 1531, Fisher and his guests were dining at his episcopal London house in Lambeth Marsh. The kitchen was busy, and a thick porridge was being prepared, and at some point during the preparation, a white powder was added to the pot. Roose was accused of adding a white powder to the porridge given to Fisher's dining guests and servants, as well as beggars to whom the food was given as charity. 2 people died, a member of Fisher's household, Burnet Kerwin, and a beggar, Alice. Many others became gravely ill. The bishop himself was untouched. He had not wanted the soup that day. The Venetian archives contain a report about Roose's interrogation and confession. He admitted having put a powder in the soup for a bit of fun, thinking the powder was a laxative. A man with a very strange sense of humor. But here is where the story fractures into something more complex and far more sinister. Roose claimed he had been given the powder by a stranger, and had believed it was intended as a joke, incapacitating his fellow servants rather than killing anyone. Historians have debated ever since whether this was true. If Roose was indeed just a pawn, if someone else provided the powder, arranged the access, and pointed him at the bishop's kitchen, then who is the person? The court of Henry VIII immediately began pointing fingers at the Boleyn family. And Boleyn, after all, feared Fisher more than almost anyone. He stood directly in the path of her marriage to the king. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was accused by rumor of supplying the poison. Even and herself was whispered about in the corners of the room. The imperial ambassador Chapuis believed Henry VIII became personally involved in the case precisely because he wanted to avert suspicion from falling on the lady and her father. By throwing the full weight of royal fury at Richard Roose, Henry VIII refused to believe the rumors about the Boleyns. There is no evidence that they or their supporters were involved in any way. But the speed of Henry's reaction, and the extraordinary nature of the punishment he invented, raises so many questions among the spectators. Was Richard Roose a murderer? Yes. Were 2 innocent people dead? Undeniably. But was he also, in some terrible way, a disposable instrument in a much larger game? A man used and then destroyed to keep a secret that may never have existed? That question hangs over everything that follows. There was no trial. Roose had no common law trial, by direct command of the king. Moreover, Roose was boiled alive at Smithfield. Without benefit of clergy, those 4 words carried a specific and devastating meaning in the 16th century. They meant that Richard Roose was denied the right to confess his sins before death. He would die without forgiveness, without last rites, without the church's blessing or mercy. He would die unclean, unshriven, with whatever sins he carried going with him unaddressed into whatever came next. He was questioned in the Tower of London, where he was tortured on the rack. There, under the application of medieval engineering to human joints and sinews, whatever he knew, or whatever they wanted him to say he knew, was extracted. He was given no opportunity to present a defense, call witnesses, or challenge the evidence against him. Henry pushed Parliament to pass a brand new law, written with staggering speed and specifically designed to destroy Richard Roose. The 9th Statute of 1531 made boiling alive the prescribed form of capital punishment for murder committed by poisoning, which was defined by the same act as high treason. The law was written. Roose was named in it specifically. A man tried under a law that did not exist until his case prompted its creation. Even by the brutal standards of Tudor justice, this was extraordinary. Henry had not merely wanted Roose punished. He had wanted something new invented for the purpose. Something the world had never seen in England. Something that would make an impression not just on a crowd but on history itself. The date of execution was set as April 5, 1531. While Richard Roose sat in the dark corner of the tower, and waited for the only end his story was ever going to have. And on April 5, 1531, hardened London spectators of public punishment gathered at Smithfield, joined by others too curious to stay away. An execution had been announced of a type that none had witnessed in their lifetimes, nor ever heard of. Smithfield, just outside the old London Wall, was already famous as a place of meat slaughter. Though its open ground had hosted executions, justs, tournaments, and public spectacles for 2 centuries. But today was different. Today, they came in silence first, a strange, uncertain quiet, as they took in what stood at the center of the ground. The cauldron. The gibbet. The fire is already burning underneath. A contemporary document described his death this way. This year was a cook boiled in a cauldron in Smithfield, for he would have poisoned the Bishop of Rochester Fisher with divers of his servants. And he was locked in a chain and pulled up and down with a gibbet at divers times until he was dead. He was pulled up and down at diverse times until he was dead. This was not a single immersion. It was not a quick drowning in boiling water. The mechanics of the gibbet meant that Roose was lowered into the rolling, churning heat, and then raised. And then lowered again. And raised. Repeatedly. He roared mighty loud, and diverse women who were pregnant felt sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead, and other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work. Think about what that means. London in 1531 was a city accustomed to public execution. These were people who watched beheadings as entertainment. And even the hardened, thick-skinned crowds of Smithfield looked at what was happening to Richard Roose and said, "We would rather see the axeman than see a man boiled alive." The screaming continued. The gibbet worked its terrible mechanism, down and up and down again. The water did what boiling water does to living flesh. And eventually, after a duration that eyewitnesses could not bring themselves to quantify precisely, Richard Roose was pronounced dead. The death of Richard Roose changed English law in ways that outlasted him by decades. The form of execution was later banned under Edward VI, deemed so horrific it should never happen again. Even in a society that burned people at the stake, hanged men until almost dead before cutting them open, displayed heads on bridges, that same society looked at what had been done to Richard Roose and decided it had gone too far. The Boiling Act was quietly repealed in 1547. No one in England was ever lowered into a cauldron again. And the man Roose had failed to kill? John Fisher's story continued for several extraordinary years, until Henry VIII, having finally gotten his divorce and his new queen. In 1535, Fisher refused to swear an oath acknowledging Henry's supremacy over the church. He was sent to the Tower. The Pope, in a gesture of defiance, made Fisher a cardinal, which only enraged Henry further. Within weeks, John Fisher, the man who had not wanted the soup Richard Roose made on that February afternoon in 1531, was beheaded at Tower Hill. If you love olden days execution stories told the way they happen, like this video, share and subscribe to this channel for more. With that said, let me know what you think about these executions, and tell me if you want part 2 of these olden days executions videos. If you're a lover of creepy true crime stories, true crime documentaries, horror crime, unsolved mysteries and the rest, you can do well to check out our twin channel Mysterious Dark Files for more videos like that.